Now that you've constructed your zipper panel piece, we're ready to go ahead and start constructing the outside of the bag. Before we start, I wanted to go over some of the pieces that you're going to need for this part of the construction process. You're going to need your bag outside, front and back pieces. If you're doing the fabric handles or the purchased wood handles, you've already got the handle parts sewn on them. And you've also got the zipper stitched into the lining if that's something that you want. You've got your zipper panel piece that's sewn, and I just wanted to point out that, in the last part when I was working on the zipper panel, I noticed that my center fronts got off a little bit, so I measured it again and remarked my center front, because you're gonna need that measurement in our next step. Then the other piece you need is your bag bottom piece. This piece, I wanted to point out, this piece has got flex foam on the back of it. It is different than what's on the back of your bag pieces. Your bag pieces have fusible fleece on them, but these have flex foam. So the reason for that is the flex foam is a lot sturdier product, so when you put the bag together, it's really going to help it hold its shape. But if you put the flex foam here and on the bag outside piece, it just gets to be a little too cumbersome. So we're going to go ahead and we are going to use the flex foam again, but we're going to put it on the lining. But I wanted to make sure that you understood that distinction before we got going. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch the zipper panel to the bag bottom piece. And we're going to do that by just stitching one of the sides first. So what I want to do is I'm going to come and I'm going to put them right side together. They're not the same size. That's okay. Don't worry about that. And on one side, I'm going to go ahead and pin these edges even. They should be really, really close to the same size. The same width, not the same length. Okay, and what we're going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and pin this. Now, if you remember, we've got a little bit of piping right here. So remember what I said the trick with piping was, is you keep sewing over the same seam over and over again. So that's what we're going to do, is I'm going to go ahead and put this down. And actually, I've got that pinned a little too high, so I'm going to go ahead and move that. I'm going to pin it again. And then I am going to go ahead and use that piping or cording foot on my machine for this step, because that piping is right there and it might get in the way of my foot. So I'm going to go ahead and put that foot on my machine. There it is. Okay. And then if you remember from yesterday, I just remembered that on my machine, I need to have the needle set 3 clicks to the right when I work with this foot. But just use whatever your machine setting is for that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put that down. And then I'm going to stitch right along that seam. Stitch. Okay, so now we've got that. Then I'm just going to open up and double check that all my layers are there. Everything's good. Okay, now you're not going to sew the other side yet, because I'm going to show you a trick that is easy, that makes it easy to make sure this bag goes together right. Okay, so now we've got one of our bag pieces. It doesn't matter which one you start with. And I've got my center marked, and I'm actually going to go ahead and use my ruler and my marking pen, and I'm going to take that center mark all the way up into that seam allowance right there, just so I can really see where that is. Okay, now this is where those centers come in handy. Oh, another tip is if you take your take a pin, just pin this so it stays out of the way. Actually, pin it up a little higher. You don't want it to misshape your piece. Okay, so now we're going to start. We're going to take this center front and we are going to pin it, matching center front to this piece and matching raw edges. And then you're just going to start pinning around the side of your bag. Now, as you do this, make sure that you don't get anything. See how, that's there. You want to keep all these layers all snug up together. And you might need to use quite a few pins at this part to really hold them tight. I'm not going to use that pin. That little pin won't hold that. Okay. I'm gonna keep going around the edge, and then I'm gonna stop right about there. So I'm gonna leave about that much of it free on the end. Now I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna pin the other direction. Making sure to keep that handle out of the way. I'm just making sure as I go that I've got all of the pieces. Okay, so now I'm going to flip this around because I'm starting to get to pin this part. It's going to be a little more cumbersome. Okay. Just want to get it. What you're trying to do is you're curving this around, but you're making sure that as you pin, you keep all these layers flat. And you don't need to clip this curve or anything, you just kind of want to naturally let it go around the curve. Now in this one, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to keep pinning, and I'm going to start pinning the foam. Okay. Now I find with this part, it's better to have the foam on the bottom because it'll mold a little easier, and that way I know I've got the fleece in the right spot. I'm going to keep pinning. Around the corner. Use quite a few pins coming around these curves here. And then you'll, okay, so as we're gonna sew this next, but I wanna point this out where you can see it. This seam is the seam that we use to attach the piping to the front of the bag. So that's gonna be our stitching line when we move on to stitching it in the next step. I just wanted to point that out since we've got a really good view of it right now. Okay, so then I'm going to stop right about here. There's two ways to do this. I'm going to show you the more foolproof way to do it first. But what we're going to do is we're going to get this and we're going to match this to this, and then we're going to cut it so that we know that it matches. You can pin that first or you can stitch it, but I'm going to go ahead and stitch it first because I feel like that's just, like I said, it's a little more foolproof way to do that. So I'm going to start stitching at one pin, and I'm going to stitch around to the other pin. And I'm going to leave the cording foot on my machine. I've done it both ways, with both a standard foot and a cording foot. I've even used a walking foot. Kind of just preference. If you don't want to use your cording foot here, you're probably okay. But I'm going to go ahead and leave mine on. Just to kind of help with a little bit of that extra bulk. Okay, so now I'm going to put my foot down here, and I'm going to stitch. And as I go, and actually, so I've got my machine at a 2.5 inch stitch length, and I'm going to go ahead and take it up to about 2.75. Because I'm working with a lot of layers, and sometimes when you're working with a lot of layers, your stitch length gets shorter than it normally would be, so it can kind of bunch up. So I'm doing my best to stay right on top of that line. I'm off a little bit right there. Okay, I'm gonna get back on. So if you find yourself that you get off the line a little bit, you'll have the opportunity to go back and fix it in individual sections. So at this point, I just really recommend that you keep stitching and then go back and fix any portions after you stitch. It gets off just a little bit when that handle gets in the way. Okay, come around this corner. Coming around the corner. Okay, so now getting ready to start stitching down here where my, okay, now look right here. See, I almost caught that, so I need to push that out of the way. So that's not going to get stitched into the layers. If you do stitch it into the layers, it's not the end of the world, you can just unpick it. But you're going to start getting to the point in the construction process where you got a lot of layers you're kind of handling all at the same time. So you want to do your best to kind of keep them all lined up. I'm just going to come around here. Keep stitching. And then I'm going to go ahead and stop where this pin is. Okay, back stitch. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of just quickly check this. So you can see it looks like I'm okay as far as layers. You want to make sure that you didn't miss any right here, that you're really close to the edge, and that you haven't accidentally stitched any of the piping into the seam. But as long as you stay on that stitching line that you stitched for the piping, you should be fine. Okay, so now what we've got to do is we've got to match these ends up. So I'm going to keep pinning around the side. If you are a quilter and you match binding ends, it's kind of a very similar idea of what we're doing right now. So I'm going to pin this around the side. Now we're going to cut some of this fabric. You're going to cut this fabric. Do not cut this fabric. I mean, you probably couldn't because there's a zipper, but just visually, you've got it in your head, you're cutting this. So what we're doing is we're bringing this up to where, so I'm going to bring this up to about here. Stitch that, or get that kind of pinned around the corner. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin this. I kind of know where it's going to lay, so I'm going to pin this end here. Okay, so now I've got it pinned, and I can see, okay, look, right there is where they're overlapping, right there. So I'm going to take my pen, and I'm going to make a mark. Okay, so now I need to account for seam allowance. So what I'm gonna do is so I can't stitch that there and there because I need a seam allowance. So you can do it either way. So if you want to kind of like visually just go, oh, okay, so if I put this here and this here, this is gonna hit about here. You can put a mark there. My guess is if you measure this mark, it's gonna be an inch. And yep, I'm right, it's an inch. So if you come up 1 inch from where that overlap mark is, go ahead and mark it. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut that. You can use a rotary cutter if you want. I've got my scissors, so I'm going to use them, but I am going to go ahead and draw a line just so that I know I've got a straight line coming across there. Then I'm going to cut this off. Okay, now I'm going to have to unpin a little bit of this. And now I'm going to stitch this to this. Pin those edges even, same way you did it for the other side of the bag. Okay, I'm going to put that in the machine and stitch that in place. Stitching again along that stitching line I used for the piping. Okay. Now I'm going to pin it. It should match up. If it doesn't match up, then I'll just unstitch it and stitch it again. I'll unpick that seam, but I think it'll be fine. Okay. Again, being careful to keep all my layers together. Getting this foam going around this curve. Okay, get this wrangled in here. Now you do want to, you want to make sure that you are getting this correct, because this is going to give your bag, the outside of your bag, its shape. So you want to make sure you've got it right. Okay, so now we're just going to pick up where we stopped stitching and go ahead and stitch around the rest of the outside of the bag. I can't remember where I stopped stitching. Okay, right there. I'm going to overlap that stitch about 1 inch. And then just start pulling it. Pulling it through. If you have, if you're having a hard time with this step, if you have a walking foot, you can try putting the walking foot on your machine. I've done it you know, I don't have a walking foot right now on. I don't have the dual feed engaged on this machine, and it's pulling the layers through just fine. But if your machine is having a hard time, the walking foot might be something you want to give it a try. Okay, then I'm going to finish stitching until I get back to where I started. I'm going to cut that off. Okay, I've got that overlapped, and then I'm going to just temporarily turn this right side out, just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Some of the things that have happened before is some of this layer of fabric hasn't gotten caught in, or I've stitched over the piping or something like that, but I think it looks pretty good. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to turn the bag back to inside out. Okay. Now you're going to do the same thing to the other side. I'm just going to unzip the zipper before I do that. And same thing. So you're just going to start center front to center front, pin around and stitch it. And that's how you're going to finish constructing the outside of the bag.